All right, we'll go ahead. Let me get my door shut and then we'll get started. Okay. Those of you that may not know me, I'm Lonnie Yenste, the County Extension Agent here in Erath County, and we appreciate those of you that are on for our Tri-County Cattle Gathering. I know this is typically held down at the Dublin Sale Barn, but as we all know, due to COVID and high risk and different things like that, we are doing an online program, and we have a great agenda lined up for you today. Also want to thank Mike Berry from Comanche County and Bruce Boyd from Hamilton County in helping plan this program and get everything together. Again, if any of you have any questions, you can either use your chat box and type in your question, or later on we'll have a time where we can open up and hopefully you can ask your questions. So we'll go ahead and go that. I know we have a lighter attendance, but I always feel like if one of you can make a change or learn something from the program, well, you've made an impact for the day. So we're going to go from that route. First up on our agenda, we have Jason Johnson. He is our economist here out of Texas AgriLife Research here in Stephenville. And as we all know, he's going to give us an economic outlook, which that dollar is most important as today. And with the COVID and with all the election going on and the CFAP, he's going to cover a little bit of all that. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Lonnie. This is the second of 3 programs I'm giving today, all cattle programs. So I guess October the 20th was a popular day among the cattle folks. I'm not real happy with the picture that I have to show today or the prices. So, just like anything else, don't shoot the messenger. But what I'm going to do is after we go through these, we'll talk a little bit about realistic management strategies in terms of ways to kind of deal with these low prices that we've seen. But, there's no way around the market. The market is the ultimate scoreboard and tells us what's it expects to be going on over the next couple of months. And so we're gonna just start right into it. Everything showing up okay, Lonnie, before I get too deep on the screen?
Everything was showing up good on the screen. You were kind of cutting in and out, but I think you're good now.
Okay. As cattle producers, high corn prices are bad for cattle prices. Low corn prices are good for cattle prices. So we'll start there. We look at the Southern Plains corn price. You'll notice since, the latter part of August, corn prices have started to rally, and that's come at that's caused some depression and prices of cattle. That corn price rally has a lot to do with weather related issues. And there's no ways around that. We've had cheap corn for quite a while now, and still relatively corn is cheap. I'm starting to hear on the RFD TV and the news and the radio, people are expecting some of this corn rally to kind of to tail off, but it certainly cost us some dollars as cattle producers, and that corn rally has a lot to do with weather, and I want to start with weather because that's going to guide us too. We know that we can be the best cowboys in the world, we can be the best businessmen in the world, but if Mother Nature doesn't cooperate, there's nothing we can do other than just to deal with it. So we are subject to Mother Nature. Here's the drought monitor, the most recent one that was released on last Thursday, and you see most of the western U.S. is impacted by drought. Some, the red, more impacted than others. But if you look at this map, it's going to lead into the next map. So This is the area affected by drought in the drought monitor. And this is the backward looking measurement of soil moisture and rainfall, et cetera. So this is the backward looking picture. So just kind of look at this. Oh, I'm getting a internet connection is unstable message. That's nice. Look at this picture of the drought monitor and you see the area affected by drought. Now the next picture, that area impacted by drought is the red cross-lined area on the map. This is corn. The green areas where corn is grown. The dark green areas where 75% of the corn crop is produced. The other light green area picks up the remaining 25%. So basically all of the corn's grown in the green area. And what we're looking for is overlap. When we look at corn, 36% of corn is now impacted in an area that's affected by drought. I'm going to go through these quick. Hay, 33%, and you'll see the drought area doesn't change in each of these maps, but 33% of the hay acreage is now experiencing drought. 40% of the cattle are in an area impacted by drought. And then we look at winter wheat, which is important, especially for us in Oklahoma. This type of year, this time of year, as we look for those calves to go on winter wheat pastures for drought. So that's not a really good situation going forward, because we know no matter when drought hits, it certainly affects our profitability, our feeding expenses, and the outlook. So those didn't scare you enough, maybe, and this is to me, this is the scariest photo I have in the whole slide set. This is the 3-month outlook. So November, December, and January. This is the shortest term outlook that they have at the National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration that they put out. And if you look up there to the left, that's the temperature probability, saying that we in Texas are expected to have above normal temperatures for those winter months. Simultaneously, the bottom right-hand picture is the precipitation outlook for November, December, and January. And you'll see that's a pretty strong below normal precip. So there's no question that the La Nina weather pattern is firmly in place. And that typically means colder and wetter for the northern US and drier and warmer for the southern US, including us. So this is what scares me as a cattle producer, is the possibility of these dry conditions that have kind of been developing over the last couple of months, now projected to be getting even worse as we go through the remaining of the year. And what that implies in terms of winter wheat grazing availability for these calves, which is the market for any calves that we normally would sell right now. That's where those calves would go, is to winter wheat. And if that's still dirt waiting on the first rainfall, that's not a pretty picture. So I'm getting the scary part out of the program out of the way first. If we go back to look at where we sit in the cattle cycle, typically as we build cattle numbers and the herds grow from one year to the next, prices go down. Only after we start reducing our cattle herd inventory to get some support. And in this last year is first year we finally rolled over. In 2019, our cattle inventory, beef cattle inventory, was 31.8 million head. January 1st of 2020, the number was 31.3 million head. So 500,000 head beef cows came off as we started liquidating the U.S. herd. That's going to take a little while, but we're on the downward slide on that, which means we should be at a place where prices can start to get a lift from inventory. And we know that it doesn't necessarily happen the first year we start reducing numbers because of the cattle cycle, and the calves born take, time to mature, and then they take the gestation period. So it's a good year and a half to two years before, after we roll over from peak cattle numbers, that the beef production starts to finally start coming down. That's led some folks to claim that the cattle market bottom is in, and this came from Beef Cattle Magazine. The date was October the 15th, so a couple of days ago. And basically the folks at Sterling Marketing saying that long term, we may very well have hit a bottom. Prices are down about 80% from the highs we hit in 2014 and 2015. They project an improvement in feedlot margins next year, and cash-fed cattle should produce positive margins in 2021. So 2020 is likely going to be the bottom for cow-calf producers as well. The outlook for cow-calf producer looks much better next year, and likely will continue for the next 2 to 3 years as that herd liquidation continues and cattle numbers go down. Now that raises a point that I'm going to talk about at the very end of this program in terms of strategies. But 2014, 2015, we hit the market peak. Anybody remember what price of female replacements were in 2014 and 2015? I'll give you a second to think about that. What were those replacement females going for in 2015? And the answer to that was they were going about $2,500. I heard people had some price for $3,000. In other words, when the market was at its peak, the factory was being priced as if those prices were going to last for a long period of time. And so those replacement female prices got bid up. In other words, the market, and cattle market's not perfect. Sometimes it thinks high prices are going to last forever. And we know that's not the case, but that's definitely what was built into the replacement female prices. We're on the other end of that spectrum now. And if this is truly the bottom of prices, or 2020 is, and there's every indication from a cattle cycle standpoint that it is, we're looking at the low calf prices for this part of the cycle. Well, guess what? Replacement female prices aren't $3,000 anymore. They're, in a sense, kind of priced like these low calf prices are going to last forever. And we know that's not the case either. We should be in a situation where prices are higher next year than they are now, and they're higher the year after that than they were the one, we got 2 to 3 years or 4 years of steadily increasing calf prices, then we have the forage to support them. And that's the big if, is that drought outlook that we just looked at before. So I'm going to throw these charts up to you in terms of the beef cattle market. They all make a lot of sense. If you look at the cattle slaughter numbers, and the solid blue line, look at that relative to the dashed line, 2020 versus 2019. We had more cows, more calves into the market coming because we're still working off that inventory from increasing cattle numbers. You see the giant drawdown in terms of cattle slaughter as the COVID crisis and the shutdown hit, especially these processing plants. Thankfully, we're back to rebound, and we've rebounded it off of that, I guess, capacity issue. And it was a supply side disruption, as they had to shut down a large portion of our slaughtering capacity because of COVID considerations. The social distancing thing doesn't work real well in a plant, but we're back to pretty much where we should be in terms of cattle slaughter, and we should expect it to trail pretty close to the 2019 numbers, if not just a little bit higher this year. Beef production, you'll see that same drop off from the COVID lockdown issues. But again, we've recovered pretty much, and it's not surprising. It was projected our beef production would be a little bit higher than last year's. And again, it's that 1 year to 18-month lag between us finally starting to reduce the herd number before we finally see a reduction in beef production as a result. Now, one of the positives of this situation was those calves, a lot of those calves stayed in the feedlot a little bit longer because of the shutdown and the disruption. And that caused beef graded as choice to be quite a bit higher to relative historically. But this probably will come back more in line with traditional trends as well, as we've kind of worked through that glut of cattle that got held hostage in the feedlot because the processing plants weren't moving. Feedlot placements, again, you see, going back to the early part of the year, we had the disruption, but now, as expected, they're just a little bit higher than last year. More cows, more calves, still working through the system. Cattle on feed over 120 days, as that feedlot glut kind of got worked through. We've gotten back down to normal on that. And then slaughter steer prices. Folks, it's not a shock that we're sitting at low prices when we're dealing with basically peak production from this part of the cycle. We should trail a little bit lower than last year. And then next year we should start jumping and steadily moving a little higher from 1 year to the next. But box beef value, again, you see the shutdown giant spike higher in terms of box beef value. And you think about the rationing and the run on meat and the prices that were there. That's gradually been worked off fairly quickly, and now we're kind of back to more of a normal curve. But all of this kind of trickles down. Again, no surprise, we should be a little bit lower than last year's prices, but not much. And after the initial shocks of the lockdown economy, we've kind of gotten back to that. This was the 5 to 6 weight. If you look at 7 weight, it's the same picture. We're trailing right on or just a tad below the previous year's price. You look at our exports, U.S. beef and veal exports. They were pretty much fell off the cliff during the lockdown, but now they're back to where we would have expected them to be, a little bit higher than last year. With the U.S. beef and veal imports, the amount coming in has gone up, and a lot of this has to do with the strength of the U.S. dollar. Slaughter cow prices, not surprisingly, and if you look at that red line kind of is an indication of a seasonal price pattern on cull cows. And it makes a lot of sense because we peak on cull cow prices during the late spring and summer, when most folks have grass to put those cull cows on. The cheapest prices for cull cows tend to be in the heart of winter, when we finally realize that she may not live to see the other side. Let's get whatever we can get for her. And the run on cull cows pushes the price down during those, and that's kind of the trend line we would expect to see as well. The other thing is the cull cow price and calf prices too. There's no question that the drought conditions, as they begin to build and there begin to be forecast, are adding some seasonal pressure on feeder cattle and cull cow prices this time of year. And the reality is those dry conditions will likely keep cattle markets a little under pressure until Thanksgiving at least. So cattle producers ought to be, aware of of that. So we look at keys in fed cattle market. The backlog in the fed cattle has largely been taken care of. You can see that in the decline of 120 plus days on feed. And that's a testament to the getting those plants back up and running. I know they ran on some Saturdays. They started running on Saturdays to keep up with the beef production and the beef slaughter, and that's helped work off a lot of this glut that everyone was watching. Beef production is above a year ago, even though we declined January 1. We know the time lag involved in the cattle production cycle meant this was when we expected to see peak beef production. The loss of the restaurant market continues to be a huge issue from a beef standpoint, and you can almost watch that market ebb and flow with the relaxation of restrictions on restaurants and then the rollback is in hotspot areas. While the at-home market did absorb a lot of that, you look at the loss of the market from restaurants and schools. To be honest, it's amazing that we were able to go through that shock as well as we did from a price standpoint. Because that is a tremendous market, the away from home market. So any improvement in our ability to get these restaurants opened at more than 50% capacity will be a tailwind to help us on prices. Trickling down to the calf and feeder cattle market, that fed cattle market definitely influences what they're willing to pay for those feeder calves. We're looking at rising feed costs, although, they're still historically tame. If you look back in that $4 to $4.50 range, the corn is perfectly acceptable. We benefited, and probably how we weathered the storm as well as we did was with this really cheap feed out there. And we're having to, we're seeing some of that go away, but we're still looking relatively good on feed prices. I think a bigger issue from the short term is going to be wheat pasture development and the winter wheat and the existence or non-existence of grazing opportunities for these calves. And that's all the drought related issue. And that's why I told you that seasonal outlook picture was the scariest thing on my radar. So David Anderson is not, since he doesn't live among us, he doesn't feel threatened. So he's willing to put together price projections from the, from Texas A&M as far in terms of different price of weight, different weight class of cattle. And, what you're seeing is the bottoming out of prices in this back part of 2020. Just like we've been saying for the last year to 2 years, we're getting there. We're fixing to turn, it's fixing to roll over. Well, I think most folks feel fairly comfortable that that's where we are. And so 2021 prices, we'll start that rebuilding, and that'll pretty much go across all classes. But we don't have to worry about some economist projections. The market tells us every day what the price outlook and price projections are. These were the closes of the market as of yesterday. Like I said, the corn market, if you look all the way out to 2022, we're staying below that 4.25. That's a very tolerable level for us as cattle producers. What I saw this morning on the cattle market was the contracts a little bit further out were doing better than the immediate ones. And that is all based on the expectation that the restaurant market will be less restrictive further out as they're able to get back to business further out in the calendar that you go. That's a positive for beef. So with that in mind, I just want to throw a couple of management things out here. This is 10-year-old data, but it's the best that we got. And at that time from SPA, which is Standardized Performance Analysis, accounting for everything, and I mean everything, including owner-operator labor, which no one figures in or thinks about, depreciation on the cows. They only last a certain number of years. Feed purchased. If you threw the whole kitchen sink costs in and think about it, it cost about $600 to maintain a female for a year. So just keep that in mind. And labor and management, 15%. So that's $90. So you can figure somewhere between $500 and $600 to maintain a female from one year to the next. Now that every female, and I know everybody on that's tuned into this presentation has 100% calf crop and never lose. So I don't have to worry about talking about slippage there, but $500 to $600 to maintain that female. And again, this was 10-year-old data. If we took those producers and separated them out between the 1/3 that made the most money, which is we call thrivers, the 1/3 that lost the most money raising cattle, and we call those the nosedivers, and then there's the third in the middle. And if you look at what they spent their money on, the group that made the most money, those thrivers, the highest expenses per female that they had were variable costs. Feed purchased. And if you look at the ones that lost the most money, the highest components in their production system were depreciation, labor, and management. In other words, fixed cost. So there's a big discrepancy between, what we want to strive for is we want the variable cost component, the feed purchases, those things to be a greater percentage of our expenses than the fixed cost components. And we know there's seasonal price patterns. This is kind of a seasonal price pattern chart, how prices move for different weight cattle through the year. And if we look where we are now through the end of the year, the seasonal price patterns tell us that those prices are supposed to go up, at least till we get to January. And then those 700 to 800 pound calves tend to fall after that. But again, that's just the normal pattern. That doesn't take into account what would happen if we really do have an intensification of the drought, a flare up of COVID and rollbacks of some of these relaxed social distancing issues, a recession, the uncertain election. All of those things can throw this thing out of whack. So what's important is your local market. And I just, for sake of illustration, I pull up two markets. I'm doing 2 cattle programs today. So I pulled up two markets that are in close proximity to the participants to see what it tells us. So this was the West auction last week, October the 15th. 1,700 head went through. That's a good, from a number standpoint, that's a pretty good volume sale. And then I took the prices of the midpoint of the weights of the steers and the midpoint of the weights of the heifers, multiplied that by the midpoint of the price range for those calves to come up with what was the check for a particular size calf. Now, if you look at, let's just say the steers, 4 to 5 weight steers, $4.50 is the midpoint. $1.20 to $1.72.5. there's 52 cents worth of difference in the spread between those. Now, a lot of that's the 100-pound weight difference. A 405-pound calf and a 495-pound calf. Some of that difference is accounted for there, but not just based on hide color differences, ear length differences, horned, castrated, vaccinated. So there's some qualitative and issues there that account for that spread. So I point that out, number one. Number two, I want to point out good young pair, $1,100 to $1,300. There's your replacement females. Good pregnancy tested cows, $900 to $1,100. So they're half price to a third of the price they were during the peak. And we're looking at a situation where prices are expected to get better over the next 3 years. Now, I'm not advocating buying your replacement females at the local auction barn, buying somebody else's problems. But what I am saying is it's an indication that these female prices may provide us some sort of an opportunity if we're able to look beyond the price right now and look into a year, 2 years into the future. So if we look at an average cow costs us between $500 and $600 to maintain every cow. Look at this on the steers. We got to get over 450 pounds before we're even bringing in a paycheck to cover that. And on the heifers, we got to bring up 550 pounds before we even get a paycheck to cover that. Now, typically, I want to look at this information to see when do I market my calves. And I use 55 cents basically. If I'm not getting 55 cents a pound by putting another 100 pounds on them, I need to sell those calves because that forage is better utilized to maintaining the body condition score of my females. I'm not getting paid for it. Now on the steers, we see one from 450 to 550, you only made 50 cents. From 550 to 650, you made 57 cents for every pound. But I'm looking at this and going, beyond 450 pounds, I'm making $105 for putting 200 pounds on that calf. That's right at 55 cents. So I might sell them at that level. On the heifers, your incentive for heavier weights stayed above my 55 cent per pound threshold as we moved down the entire list. So that was the West auction. The other program I'm going to do tonight is in Graham, Texas. And I just pulled up the Wichita Falls livestock market to use their illustration. And they had a wider range of calves in their sale last week. Last Wednesday, they sold 1,200 heads. So it was a really good sale. If you look at the steers for this market, all the way through to those really heavy weights, you never went below that 55 cent per pound. But I'll tell you what, at 750 pounds, I'm not going to risk a certain paycheck at $960 to try to get the other $70 for another 100 pounds. But on the heifers, you look, any weight beyond 650 pounds on those heifers, we get real iffy. And in fact, if you looked at from 650 pounds to 950 pounds, the check was only $100 difference. That's 33 cents a pound for that. Get rid of those heifers at that 650 pound and let that forage go to something else. This is the kind of information that you want to look at when you're making those marketing decisions and think about it. And again, I'll call your attention, bred cows, $850 to $1,200. Maybe some opportunities there. Last thing I want to hit on is just some basically cost issues. If we're at the low point in prices, then we have to be really frugal and really careful managing our costs. and the biggest cost we're going to face over the next several months is doing our supplemental feeding, our winter feeding program. For many people, that includes hay. So without a doubt, having looked at the numbers, I put together the 5 highest rate of return on investments having to do with hay. First is soil test, if you're producing hay. Second is hay testing, whether you're selling hay or buying hay. The cost of that hay test to know exactly what's in that bale so that you feed it properly or you buy it at the right price is a very high rate of return on investment. The next is the PRF insurance, the rainfall index insurance. And I'll show you specifically what that rate of return on that investment has been. Hay rings to minimize feeding losses would be fourth, and then hay storage, increasing hay storage capacity to be able to buy hay when it's cheap and not have to buy it when it's expensive. And you looked at that drought situation, I wouldn't expect hay prices to be getting a lot cheaper over the next couple of months. So those were the highest rate of return investments on hay: soil test, hay test, and then this pasture rangeland forage insurance, which I want to walk you through. Basically, if y'all are familiar with it, you're insuring a % of normal rainfall. And if you look at our weather situation, weather is the biggest risk that we face as livestock producers that we have virtually no control over. This is the only risk management product we have for weather. And by weather, I'm talking a lack of moisture. So you go to the map, I typed in Hamilton County, Texas. It pulls up a grid and you'll see Hamilton is there in the center of the screen. That grid number is 1392. And basically everything in that box, in that grid, is treated the same. So you can see roughly it's a 15 mile by 15 mile area. I know it looks rectangular here, but kind of give you some perspective. You see Comanche up there, two grids over, and you see Meridian 2 grids over. But basically you're insuring a % of normal rainfall in that grid. Everybody in that grid is treated the same. And for the sake of the illustration, I ran a scenario where I insured 85% of normal rainfall. Anytime in any 2-month interval, we got below 85% of normal rainfall for that 2 months, then you collected a check. I insured 150% of the county's base value of production. And you enroll your acreage over the calendar. I put 30% of my acreage between September and February, concentrating 70% of my enrollment in March through August, where most of my warm season grasses and forage production would be expected to be produced. Now that policy cost me, the producer, $2.96 per acre. If I got above 85% of normal rainfall production in every 2-month interval, I would owe $2.96 per acre. Now the USDA subsidy on that is $3.61. In other words, if I was going to pay the true cost of this program alone out of pocket, that would cost $6.57 per acre. But Uncle Sam is going to pay 55% of that on my behalf. Why? Because they don't like having to do disaster declarations all the time. They subsidize crop insurance. They subsidize for crop producers. They're subsidizing this rainfall insurance for livestock producers at the same essential level, trying to provide an incentive for you to create your own safety net. Now, what that does is it creates a safety net that's basically rigged in your favor because somebody else is paying 55% of the true cost. So that's 85% in rainfall protection level, and 150% of the county base for Hamilton County means I'm buying a coverage level of $34.17. If it did not rain at all during the year, the insurance policy would pay me $34.17 an acre on grazing land. So what I did was I went and back tested this particular scenario for the last 20 years and realized 2020 isn't over yet. In fact, they haven't even finalized, I think, July and August rainfall intervals. And what you see here is the per acre net return above the premium of $2.96. In other words, in 2004, you see negative $2.96. You owed the full premium. It rained above 85% of normal rainfall in all 2 month intervals in that year. Okay, the 20-year average, if you participated in this program every year for 20 years, your net would be not owing a premium, but getting a check for $2.39 per year. That's $2.39 per acre above the premium. That is the average result participating in the program for 20 years for this grid that is represented where Hamilton, the city of Hamilton lies, and then that area around it. So in 2004, you owed the full premium. Here is the actual rainfall index values for 2004. In January and February, and this is the second column from the right, actual index value, 136% of normal rainfall for January and February, 172% for March and April, 209% for May and June, 246% of normal rainfall in July and August, 102% in September and October, and 282% of normal rainfall for November and December. All of those are above 85% of normal, so you didn't collect any insurance money. Dang it. Chances are you were very profitable that year because you had, a lot of forage production. In 2011, we all remember that year. That's the year where we had the largest indemnity payout. Your payout was $14.87 per acre, which was in 2011, $11.91 above your premium. In 2011, you look at those actual index values, 70%, 18%, 54%, 30%, 86%. Look, we didn't collect anything in that interval. And in the next one, 112%, we didn't collect anything there either. So 2 of the 6 intervals, we didn't collect anything on because we got too much rainfall. You still netted 1487, or you collected 1487. I'm not saying you want this is not the check you want, but it's at least a consolation prize to inadequate rainfall. Now, this pasture rangeland forage product, the deadline for enrolling for next year, I believe, is November the 15th. So you've got a couple of weeks to get this in place for next year if you haven't done it. But to me, if you look at this product, has generated an 81% return on your investment over the last 20 years, every year. I mean, on average, if you participated every year on average, you would have reaped a 81% return on investment. You don't have to use the 85% rainfall trigger. Obviously, if you could use a 90%, anything below 90% of normal rainfall would trigger a payment. That price to the producer is a little higher, and it's subsidized a little lower. This table shows you the different rainfall triggers and the fact that the producer premium, the lower you willing to go on the rainfall trigger that generates a payment, the cheaper the premium is, the higher the subsidy is, and the lower the acre protection per acre of protection is. Now, this should not be a surprise that it generates a positive return on investment. It has to, because somebody else is paying a good chunk of the program costs. That subsidy is why I say this product is basically rigged in the favor of the producer to participate. And you'll see, just for comparison, Young County, which is in Grantham tonight, same situation. The cheaper the rainfall trigger, the cheaper the premium, the higher the subsidy. And then, so you can basically, just like any other insurance, you can pick your level of deductible to pay only what you're wanting to pay, and buy that level of protection. Again, the odds are stacked in your favor because of the subsidy. And just to show you, this is the Graham analysis, very similar. 14 of the 20 years, you didn't owe a premium, you just collected a check. That is the same 70% success rate in terms of a payout for as was for Hamilton County. Now, they netted out $4.11 above the premium on average. That's 132% return on investment. That's just the quirks of that particular grid. But in every case, this product is rigged in your favor. So I would encourage you to think about it, because it is the consolation prize that doesn't exist anywhere else in terms of weather management. Prettier nativity scene, not a pretty picture if you're an economist in losses from hay. These are the loss percentages from different types of rings, hay rings. And you'll see the more expensive ones, the ones on the, you know, the modified cone ring and the sheeted bottom steel ring, those are going to cost you a little bit more. But notice they reduce the amount of loss from waste 10 to 15% compared to these cheaper other rings. And that just, from trampling and defecation, makes a lot of sense. It doesn't take long to recuperate your cost to buy these pieces of equipment when you reduce the losses of hay by that amount. And then the last one was the keeping it out of the weather, keeping it dry, especially if you were going to utilize or market it from one year to the next. The quality of hay can be preserved amazingly if it's kept dry, kept inside. And that can justify the cost of even some rudimentary type hay storage facilities. So the last thing I got is basically this. We've done some work with Sale Barn data to look at the premiums for different activities and the discounts for other activities. And you can see, you know, castration above 600-pound calves, you can avoid a discount. It's some of the lighter weight calves, we don't notice a discount being applied so much. But dehorning, you can avoid a discount. Vaccination, you can get a premium. Weaning calves prior to sale and selling in through those special sales, you can get a premium. Marketing in uniform lots, 5 head, 10 head, truckload lots, those things can all command a premium. These things can add up to be $50 to $100 a head. Now, people laughed when we were selling calves for $1,200 a piece at even messing with this. But when calves are $650 or $750 here at the low point of prices, and we know that we're spending $600 on that cow, $50 means a lot more when those calves are cheap. And so this is just one of those strategies we can do, some sound management practices to avoid the discounts or to get some premiums that might add $50 to $100 per head to our pocket. So I'm sorry the news isn't any better than it is, but it's better to face the reality. And the good news is all indications are is this is where we start the upturn in prices, given a little bit of help from Mother Nature. Maybe we can take advantage of that. Last thing I want to remind you of is if you did participate in the CFAP program and get paid a little bit for the number of head of cattle you have, there's a second round of that program You're not automatically enrolled. So you need to contact the USDA Service Center office, make an appointment. Basically, you're going to turn in your head count of calves, the inventory of calves that you had, I think from April through August. You pick the point of them and you'll get like $55 a head for however many head of marketable calves or even retained females that you had during that period. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of that program as well. With that, I will shut up and let you move along, and hopefully, like I said, don't be mad at the messenger.
Oh, no, Jason, we appreciate your time today. Is there anybody that has a question you can unmute or type it in the chat box and we will get him to answer it?
Hey, Jason, I've got a comment. I should have made it before we started, but I forgot about it. It may affect things some as well. You know, the dairy co-ops have just started a co-op, have just started a quota, and each co-op's a little different, but they're taking about 10% of the milk out of the market during the prime time of year, which here is in the springtime. So we don't know if that's going to be more cull cows going to the market or how that's going to work out, but that's something that may influence some prices here in the near term as well.
Right. And I remember those discussions going on, and they were trying to figure out how much of a head count manipulation was going to be required versus controlling their, doing that, getting that 10% through some modification of diet and reduced production in that way. So I don't think we really know, but it certainly has the ability to have some impact, especially locally in terms of the market.
Okay. We do have a comment in the chat box, and yes, John, this information is being recorded, so we can get a link to you later. So if there's any others that would like it, go ahead and shoot one of us an email and we'll be glad to get it to you. Any other questions? All right. Well, we sure thank you again for Jason, for your time. And
thank you. I will go now depress some producers in the next county over.
Well, it's still something we have to think about.
I understand. Thank y'all.
All right. Next up, we'll move along our agenda. If you saw the old agenda, we had Jason. Today is the day of Jason's, I guess. We had Jason Smith, and of course, he has another appointment today. And we're thankful that Jason Banta, and actually did it with short notice. He agreed to come help us out with our program today, and we're happy with that. He's going to cover a little bit. Of course, we saw on the drought monitor is there's a possibility, and hopefully we'll prove that wrong. But we need to talk a little bit about drought feeding, and then also as we're heading into the winter, he's going to talk about a little bit about winter feeding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Lonnie. Are the slides showing up okay and sound coming through
Yes,
good?
looks perfect.
All right, good deal. But at any point in time you have any questions, don't hesitate to type those in the chat box. I'll be looking at that as we go today. But as Lonnie said, I'm going to talk about basic supplementation, and then we'll kind of wrap up with a few specific things from a drought standpoint, if that does affect you. So when we think about the three primary things that affect supplementation of protein and energy, it's going to be body condition score of those cows. Are they in good shape? Are they in poor shape? They're kind of in the middle. What are the nutrient requirements of those cows? So are they dry in late gestation? Are they nursing a calf? And then how does their forage quality look? And we'll talk about all these in detail and then talk about how they'll affect our supplementation programs. So just kind of as a recap, when we think about body condition score, one of the reasons we pay so much attention to it from a nutrition standpoint is because it's a huge driver of pregnancy rates in cows. And so this is a study from Florida, but when we look at the studies across the nation, we see the same pattern. So if we look at pregnancy rate on the vertical axis, body condition score across the horizontal axis, remember body condition score is going to range from a 1 to a 9, with the 1 being really, really thin, 9 being really extremely fat. So mature cows, you can see as we increase those body condition scores, we increase those pregnancy rates until we start to kind of flatten out here between about a 5 and a 6. So what that tells us is on mature cows, and for the purpose of this discussion, we'll talk about mature cows being 4 years of age or older. To optimize pregnancy rates on those cows, we need to make sure they're in a body condition score of at least 5 or greater prior to or at calving. So 5 or greater for those mature cows. For those 2 and 3 year old females, we're going to want them to be in a body condition score of 6 or greater at or just prior to calving. So if your spring calving operation, probably have just recently weaned those calves, we have just a little bit of time here before we get into winter to try to get those cows back into shape, then hold them steady through the winter until they calve again in the spring. When we look at nutrient requirements of females, what we're really going to focus on here is crude protein and then percent TDN. And this is if we let the cows eat all the standard forage they wanted or all the hay they wanted, what quality would we need to keep them steady so they're not gaining weight, they're not losing weight. If we look at a 2-year-old female at peak lactation, and peak lactation is going to be about 60 days post-calving, she's going to need a diet that's at least 11.5% crude protein and about 60% TDN. If we look at a 3-year-old cow at peak lactation, because she's producing a little more milk, she's going to need about 12.5% protein, 61% TDN. And if we look at a mature cow at peak lactation, about 12.5% protein and 61% TDN. You don't have to memorize all of these. If you'll just kind of remember that 12.5 and 61% is kind of the highest values we're going to talk about. If we contrast that to a 3-year-old female about 2 weeks before she gets ready to calve, she would need something that's about 9% protein, 58% TDN, and then that mature cow about 2 weeks before calving, about 8.5% protein and 55% TDN. So you can just kind of remember, if we're looking at anything below 8.5% and 55% TDN, we're likely going to need to be supplementing there. So that kind of gives us some idea of the differences between those dry pregnant cows and then those lactating cows. Now, all that's assuming we're talking about a cow in body condition score of 5. So just kind of remember a 5, we can't see any ribs on that cow. From hooks to pins, she's filled back in with muscle, so she's not dipped in there, but we really haven't put any fat pones on that cow yet. So what happens if our cows look like this? So if we look at this cow, immediately your mind should think, whoa, she's too thin. That cow's barely a body condition score 3. So if I had cows look like this, I would need to feed them a fair bit more than the requirements we talked about a couple of slides ago, because I need to maintain them, but I also got to put additional weight on them. So we've got to feed them more. On the flip side, if we look at some cows like this that are in really good shape, so potentially body condition score 7, look at that big fat pone back there on each side of the tail head, that would tell us if our hay came back that was fine on protein, but just a little short on TDN, instead of supplementing those cows to make up that shortage for TDN. And remember, TDN is just a way to talk about energy, that I could just let that cow pull some of those extra fat reserves off and wouldn't necessarily need to supplement in that situation. So the third component we talked about was forage quality. And this is something, the better job we can do on forage quality, the less we're going to have to supplement in the long run. So some of the key factors affecting forage quality are going to be species, maturity, so how long has that forage been growing, and then temperature. So some generalizations when we talk about species is cool season forages are going to be higher quality than warm season forages. Annuals will be higher quality than perennials. And then generally speaking, forages grown in an arid environment are going to be higher quality than those forages grown in a humid environment. If we look at that in a little more detail, when we talk about cool season annual forages for our environment in Central Texas there, we're talking about things like wheat, oats, ryegrass, small grain rye would be examples of cool season annual forages. That's going to be the highest quality forage we have. The next kind of group there, we're looking at some annual warm season forages. So things like Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan hybrids, those kind of things. Really great from a hay standpoint. I know it's been a little bit challenging the last several years if you've had to deal with the sugarcane aphid, but some pretty high quality forages there. Then that next group, again, staying with warm season forages, native range, so things like little blue stem, big blue stem, crabgrass, an annual there, but actually high quality forage if you do have some crabgrass, and then pearl millet as well. Don't see quite as much pearl millet in that area. We'll see more of the sorghums. And then we think about introduced perennials like old world blue stems. And remember, those are quite a bit different than little blue stem and big blue stem. We're talking about things like KR blue stem and WW beadall. Johnson grass can actually be pretty high quality comparatively. Tifton 85 as well. And then kind of the lowest in there would be our Bermuda grass species. So we have those species differences, and we know some are going to be higher quality than others, but even within those, we have to be aware of how does maturity affect that forage. And I know the previous speaker talked about hay some, and I'm going to talk about managing that hay to optimize or maximize that quality so that we can reduce the supplementation that needs to go along with it. So this happens to be some work that was done on coastal Bermuda grass, and they looked at if they cut it every 3 weeks throughout the growing season, how much did it yield? What was the TDN? Or if they cut it at other intervals. So you can see on average, if they cut it every 3 weeks, we were looking at about 65% TDN. Think back to those requirements I was talking about. We're talking about 61 being the highest. So that's just a reminder, if we do a really good job on hay, we can meet the requirements of those cows. Cutting every 4 weeks, about 62% TDN, every 5 weeks, 59, every 8 weeks, 54, every 12 weeks, 51. So you see that quality continues to go down. Another thing with introduced forages like Bermuda grass, and I know in that area there's a fair number of Bermuda grass hay fields, is we kind of have to figure out that happy medium between quality and yield, because you need enough out there to justify the cutting. These yields, we won't see this high in Texas, not anywhere in Texas, but it gives us a good illustration of how these patterns affected, or these cutting patterns affected yield. So you can see if they cut more frequently, or quality was better, their seasonal yield was a little lower. As we cut less frequently, give that plant more time to recover, our yield goes up until it kind of hits a point where we don't see any benefit anymore, and it continues to drop. So that's a good reminder for us. If we're talking about an introduced forage, we really want to try to cut that about every 4 to 5 weeks to get a good representation of quality and yield both. If you're cutting some native range fields out there, some little blue stem, we can let that go longer because the quality won't drop as severely as it will with the introduced forages, but it still does drop over time. Temperature is a big one. Most people don't realize, and this is going to apply to really all of our warm season species, whether they're native or introduced, is if we think about that quality, and this shows digestible dry matter, just think about that as another way to talk about energy. So the higher, the better. In the spring, really good. As we get into the summer and it gets hotter, that quality goes down. As we start to cool back off in the fall, the quality will start going up until it kind of levels off there late fall. Now that would happen even if we had that hay or that pasture growing under a pivot. It's just we get more lignin deposition in the heat of the summer, which really drops the quality on that forage. So if we're thinking about hay from a cow standpoint, I really like that first cutting of the year, and the last cutting of the year will tend to be my better quality hay from a TDN standpoint especially. So determining hay quality, and I'm going to suggest that we sample each cutting or load of that hay. We definitely want to analyze it for TDN and crude protein. And TDN gets a little tricky. There's not a direct measurement. We have to measure several different things to estimate that TDN. I'm going to tell you, unfortunately, there's a lot of labs around the country that just don't do a very good job of that. So make sure when we do send those samples off to get the best value out of that hay test that you're spending money on, let's make sure we send it to a lab that's using the best technology, and we get the appropriate analysis for that particular sample. So I'll tell you, the lab I personally send samples to is going to be the Dairy One Forage Lab in New York. They do a really good job of estimating TDN and some other things, and really good turnaround time there. Dr. Smith typically sends his to Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania. Either one of those labs we're both comfortable with. It's just which one we kind of use the most over time. The big thing I would strongly encourage you to do before you send that hay sample off is visit with the nutritionist who you may be seeking recommendations from, so we can get that sample sent to the best lab and the most appropriate analysis done on it. One of the most frustrating things for me as a nutritionist and the producer who paid to have the sample sent off is when it gets sent to a lab that's not using the best techniques. They call me up and say, hey, Jason, here's my hay test, help me with recommendations. The first question I'm going to ask them is, where was it sent? And depending on where it was sent, my next response may be, unfortunately, don't worry about reading me any of those results. I don't have any confidence in making recommendations off those numbers. Now, that's not going to mean I'm not going to give you recommendations. We're just going to ask a bunch of questions. We're not going to use that hay test. So really visit with the nutritionist so you get that return on investment on that hay test rather than just some numbers that aren't extremely helpful for us. When we get that hay test back, the two big things we're going to focus on is what we call adjusted crude protein. So you see they have crude protein and adjusted crude protein here. And on this sample, they happen to be the same. This is another thing that most labs don't test for. Very few labs in the state of Texas actually do. I can't actually think of one on the top of my head, off the top of my head, that checks for adjusted crude protein. And what we're actually checking for there is heat damage, meaning did that hay get put up a little wet and we had some heating going on? And if we had that heating going on, we'll actually get a Maillard reaction that will tie up some of the protein and some of the carbohydrates. And so if that happens, like this lab, this is from Dairy One, they will actually drop that crude protein value down. And that's where the adjusted crude protein comes in. That's really important to make sure the lab is checking for that. I had a conference call with a county agent and a producer yesterday. All 4 hay samples we looked at all had heat damage and fairly significant heat damage in them, that if we hadn't sent it to the right lab, we wouldn't have known that, and we wouldn't have done the best job of feeding that we could. So we want to make sure we're using that adjusted crude protein value there, and then TDN, we're going to look at that value as well. When we think about out on pasture, it really typically doesn't make sense to go out there and clip that forage unless we're worried about some kind of specific health issue going on. But if we're just talking about traditional management, it's probably not worth clipping that forage. So what we're going to do to look at determining that forage quality is think back to those species and those species differences. If we're grazing some cool season annual forages, we know those are going to have plenty of protein and energy in them, and we're not going to need to supplement those things. We want to look at the growing conditions. So how mature is that forage? What time of the year is it? And then something that works really well from a protein standpoint, at least, is fecal consistency. So if you look at those fecal patties and they're hitting the ground and splattering, that tells us we have plenty of protein in there. We don't need any protein supplementation. Doesn't tell us 100% on energy, but generally we're dealing with a pretty good high quality forage there that has plenty of energy as well. But with energy, we want to look at the body condition of those cows too. On the flip side of that is if we see those manure patties that are getting firm, they're getting tall and kind of stacking up, that tells us those cows are definitely protein deficient. And by supplementing a little protein, the rumen microbes will actually digest that forage better, so the cows will get more utilization out of it and they can actually eat a little bit more. So looking at manure patties can really give us a lot of indication, especially from a protein standpoint. So when we think about supplementation and feeding scenarios during the winter, everybody wants cheap and easy. Cheap and easy just really doesn't exist in the beef cattle industry. So what we're going to talk about is easiest and least expensive. Then we're going to talk about if we need to supplement, what are some options and considerations from a hand-fed supplementation standpoint versus a self-fed supplementation standpoint. So when we talk about easiest and least expensive is good forage quality management. So we have good growing forage out there. In those situations, we're not thinking about providing any protein or energy supplement, just mineral supplementation typically, whether that's in the spring and some cool season annual forages like this, or if we're talking about the majority of the year and talking about introduced forages, this happens to be some Old World Blue Stem there. It's typically when we have plenty of forage for those cows to select from and it's growing, we're not looking at needing to supplement at all in that situation, at least from a protein and energy standpoint. Another one is if we do a good enough job of putting hay up and really focus on that hay quality, we can have hay that's good enough so we don't have to look at any protein and energy supplement. If we think back, especially 34 years ago, we often used to think about using hay as supplement during the wintertime, especially when we were dealing with little square bales. But with the invention of big round bales, we really don't pay as much attention on quality as what we used to. And if we would, it would save us some money and definitely some labor in the long run moving forward. Another thing to kind of think about here is if we're dealing with a forage that will respond to nitrogen fertilizer, let's think about the economics of using some fertilizer versus going out and buying supplement. So if we think about what is a pound of nitrogen fertilizer cost, assuming you're going and picking it up and spreading it on your own, depending on what you're looking at and where, we're going to be somewhere between about 45 and 55 cents per pound of nitrogen right now. Just to keep the math simple, let's say we're looking at 50 cents per pound of nitrogen. When we're looking at some of these warm season forages like the Bermuda grass, if we get back to some of our annuals like that Sudan grass or those sorghum Sudan hybrids, most research would suggest, assuming we're not limited on other nutrients and we're getting a decent amount of rain, for every pound of nitrogen we put down, we'll get somewhere between 20 to 40 pounds of forage production in most situations. So if we think on the conservative end of that, just say, all right, for every pound of nitrogen, we get 25 pounds of forage produced. So if I spent 2 pounds of nitrogen, that would be 50 pounds of forage. If we talked about that costing 50 cents per pound, we're looking at, we spent $1 to get 50 pounds of high quality forage. When you go to buy a sack of feed, what's the cheapest you're looking at? $6, $8 a sack, $8 to get something with some decent quality in it. So can fertilizer be a good investment? Absolutely. It can be a really good investment and save us quite a bit of money in the long run. So that's one of those situations where we really have to look at the numbers and figure out what math works the best rather than just hearing what the coffee shop conversation is about maybe this is too expensive or this isn't a good buy. We got to sharpen that pencil and figure out where the best expenditure is for our operation. Other thing I did want to mention there on that hay from a feeding standpoint, previous speaker talked about hay rings and they can definitely help. I would tell you, I would even consider going a step further than that. And if you go to unrolling that hay, we can actually reduce hay waste even more by unrolling that hay than feeding it in the ring. And another nice advantage of unrolling that hay is we don't have some of the longer term impacts on forage production around that hay ring. So if you've never done it, if you're feeding hay or if you know somebody who's feeding hay, go to Google Earth and get a satellite image, and you can see for that next year where that hay was fed, because we've lost forage production in that area. So that's another potential advantage of unrolling that hay versus using a hay ring. So if we do need to supplement, for most cow-calf operations, when we're talking about protein and energy supplementation, the two most likely times we're going to need to do that is late summer, when that forage quality starts to decline. So a lot of you maybe have experienced in August and September, and since we hadn't got any rain really for most of Central Texas, even now, is those manure patties really started stacking up late summer and then early fall here. And then again, during the winter, depending on what our forage quality is, if we're feeding hay, or if we're dealing with some standard forage like little blue stem out there, what the quality is there and what we may need to supplement. So when I think about protein and energy supplements, I'm going to break them up into 3 groups. So realize most all feeds, with the exception of just 1 or 2, are going to supply protein and energy. But from a cost standpoint or concentration from a nutrient standpoint, some of those supplements are better used as protein supplements. Some of them are better used as energy supplements, and then some of them make a good combination of both protein and energy. So when we think about feeds we would typically use as energy sources, is if you have bunks to feed in, whole corn is an excellent option there. That's another good option if we need to stretch hay from a drought feeding standpoint. I definitely would prefer whole corn over cracked corn or steam flake corn and want to avoid ground corn. That whole corn would be the cheapest per unit of nutrient. If we look at whole corn, it'll run 88 to 89% TDN typically. Cracked corn will run about 91. Steam flake corn will run about 93. But when we run the cost per unit of TDN there, that whole corn is going to come out being the best buy when we're talking about cow-calf operations. The other advantage of that whole corn is it's much safer from a rumen health standpoint than what that flake corn would be or that cracked corn would be. Now you're going to see some of that come through the manure occasionally. Don't worry about that. We figured that into the TDN equation there. If we need to feed on the ground and we're looking for an energy source, then 11 to 14% protein, high energy cubes can be some really good options for us. Other feeds we'll use from time to time are things like soybean hulls, wheat midds, rice bran. With any of these energy supplements, it's going to be very important that we start off slow and gradually increase the levels in the diet so we avoid rumen health problems. If we need a source of both protein and energy, so that forage came back where we're low in protein and low in energy, maybe we're low in protein, but the cows are not in the body condition score we need both some protein and energy. 20% cubes can be a good option, and we'll talk about how to pick and choose those here in a minute. Corn gluten feed works well. Distillers grains, if we do have some winter pasture, it can work very well to limit graze that. That can be our cheapest option from a protein and energy supplementation standpoint. Some people will use whole cotton seed. If we're doing that, we want to make sure we limit that to about 6 to 8 pounds per cow per day. If we're talking about bulls, I'd want to be a little less than that. And again, on our energy and protein supplements, we need to gradually increase the level in the diet so we don't have rumen health issues. When we think about protein sources, and when we get over to that Hamilton, Comanche, Erath County area over there, especially for those producers that are dealing with little blue stem, protein supplement during the winter is going to be very common for us and work very well. Cottonseed meal works good, 38 or 40% protein cubes can work well. Soybean meal over the last few years is actually priced in a few times where it was the cheapest option. So that's something to pay attention to. When I priced it yesterday, it wasn't, but it's really close. Sunflower meal, alfalfa hay works pretty good as a protein supplement. However, it hasn't priced in real well for us the last several years, really since about 2012. Again, winter pasture, limit grazing that winter pasture can be a great protein supplement. And then urea-based feeds can work all right with the limited amount in the right situation. If I had my preference, I would typically prefer a natural protein source, but in the right situation and limited amount, urea can work okay. So when we think about those hand-fed supplements, so this is something I'm going to be going and giving those calves either daily if I'm feeding energy and protein, or less frequently if I'm feeding just protein, but I'm feeding it directly to those cows. It's real easy to increase or decrease amounts as forage quality or conditions change. There's a lot of options to choose from. Hand-fed supplements are typically going to be cheaper per unit of nutrient, especially TDN, than what self-fed supplements would be. There is going to be a potential a little bit more labor involved there. When we think about hand-fed supplements, depending on your situation, the first thing I think about, if troughs are available and you're feeding in troughs from a protein standpoint, is going to be straight cottonseed meal. If I need energy, straight whole corn. If I need both, I can actually mix these two together or feed the corn and just top dress the cottonseed meal on it. And I can create a really high quality 20% cube in that situation by mixing 1/3 cottonseed meal and 2/3 corn. That'll give me a little over 20% protein, about 84% TDN. You'll see here in a minute when we look at some traditional 20% cubes, we're going to be talking low 70s TDN. So that's one of the nice advantages of using a straight commodity, is typically we're dealing with a higher energy value there. When we're thinking about cubes needing to feed on the ground, those cubes are typically going to be 3/4 or 7/8 of an inch in diameter. A lot of people have questions about cubes versus pellets. Most of the times we're talking about the exact same formulation being used in both situations. It's just what dye did we push it through to make those different sizes there. And really that size change is just based on feeding situation and animal size. If we're feeding on the ground, we need to be in cubes. If we're feeding in bunks, we could be cubes or pellets. If I'm feeding young growing animals, I'd rather feed pellets than cubes. Those pellets, they'll just eat a little bit better. But if I need to feed some replacement heifers out on native range, they'll learn to eat those cubes and get along with them just fine as well. So if we think about cubes being another very common option when we're thinking about hand-fed supplements, the cube that we would use from a protein supplementation standpoint. So I'm good on energy, either because the forage has enough in it or the cows have plenty and the forage is just a little short. And what I'm really looking for is protein supplement. Then a 40% cube is what I'd be looking for. A 40% cube is just kind of a generic term. Those are going to be either tagged as 38 or 40% crude protein. Typically, we're going to run mid 70s there on those supplements. The difference between whether the company tags it as 38 or 40 is typically if they've added some calcium back to it or a binder back to it, they'll tag it as 38. Otherwise, they'll tag it as 40. But basically, we're talking about pretty much a straight cottonseed meal cube. When we look at 20% cubes, that's where we would think about being a combination protein and energy supplement. And again, remember, we need to gradually increase the levels in the diet. And so this is an example from a feed company, and they actually market 3 different versions of a 20% cube. So all of them are 20% protein. So what are the differences? And more specifically, what are some of the differences that we can see on the feed tag? And unfortunately, feed tags aren't going to tell us crude protein. So what we really want to focus in there is crude fiber. You can look at crude fat a little bit, but in most situations, crude fiber is going to be more important. And what we want to remember there is the higher the crude fiber number, the lower the TDN. So if we look at this first cube they offer, and they just call it a 20% NP cube, that just stands for natural protein. It tested at 72% TDN, 10% crude fiber. Now this TDN wasn't on the feed tag, but this particular company actually had information on their website with TDN listed for those feeds. So this is what we're looking for here. We got enough TDN to make a difference there. If we look at this next one, they call it their 20% high fiber NP cube. It's only 57% TDN. If you think back to those nutrient requirements earlier, we talked about those lactating cows needing 60 or 61% TDN, those dry cows needing somewhere between 55 and 58. There's not enough TDN in here to really be useful from a supplementation standpoint. So this is one of those feeds I would kind of say is more to have a feed to sell rather than have a feed that really helps us from a supplementation standpoint. If you look at that TDN 57 there, you can see the crude fibers up quite a bit more, 15%. The third cube they sell is one they call a 20% equivalent protein cube, meaning it's a combination of natural protein and non-protein nitrogen. Non-protein nitrogen typically is going to be urea. Sometimes it will be ammonium chloride there. And what you'll see on the feed tags, it'll give you the crude protein value, and then there'll be a statement that says not more than however much percent crude protein from NPN. And in this situation, 6.6% crude protein. You'll see some, especially if we get into some tubs or something, it may be almost all NPN on those feeds. But again, when we look at this one, very low TDN, higher crude fiber. So from a price standpoint, the one at 72% TDN is going to be the highest price per bag. This high fiber one's going to be in the middle one. This one that has high fiber plus urea is going to be the cheapest. But when we look at from a supplementation standpoint, this one's actually going to be the best buy per unit of energy here in this situation. So don't just look for the cheapest one, find the one that's the best buy per unit of nutrient and that's going to have enough energy in it to make a difference. Because regardless of cost, you'd have to basically feed nothing but cubes to try to meet the needs of a dry cow, and you would be short on a lactating cow with these two. So really look at that crude fiber level. We're trying to find something that's 10 or 11% crude fiber or less in those situations. If we needed an energy supplement, so we were good on protein, again, we're looking for something that's going to be 12 to 14% crude protein typically. We got to look at that crude fiber level again. So two examples from that same company. One of them's 8% crude fiber. So that would tell us TDN is going to be higher, and it is quite a bit in this case, 75% TDN. On the 12%, on this one here, 18% crude fiber, you see how low that TDN is. So this cube, if I was just looking at something to call the cows in the pen, that may be what I look for. If I'm looking at providing nutrient supplementation, specifically energy in this situation, this would be the cube I was looking for. We're starting to see more distillers grains cubes out on the market. That's a growing segment of the industry. It's important there to make sure those companies are checking for aflatoxins. Most of them are, but just always double check that. Typically, it's going to be their corn distillers. There is some grain sorghum distillers or a mix of those being used in Texas. And sometimes distillers grains, whether it's in a cube or loose distillers grains, we see some variation there, especially with the loose. We see a little less variation if they're cubing it. The reason we see less variation when they're cubing it is because it takes a special process to cube it. So they're really focusing on that distiller's grains a little bit more than if it was potentially a loose product. This would be a very good combination protein and energy supplement if you needed both and you had access to that. We do have at least one plant that I'm aware of in Texas out of Level Land that's marketing a distiller's grains cube. But just like with the majority of the other feeds we talked about, we need to start off slow and gradually increase. And when I talk about starting off slow, we're talking about a mature cow, start her off at about 2 pounds, and then I would gradually build her up from there. So let's say I needed to go to 5 pounds. I'd do that over about a 7 to 10 day period. Some more things to think about from a cube standpoint is sometimes you'll see cubes marketed as a forage extender. Those are rarely going to be a good option in any situation. They're just too low in TDN and they don't have enough meaningful roughage in them to really replace hay. So those are what we typically want to avoid. Just go get you a good low fiber 20% cube in those situations. Depending on how much cubes we're having to feed, if we're having to feed real high levels, we may need to pay attention to the calcium phosphorus ratio. Generally, that's not going to be an issue. And then if we're dealing with some native forages that have been dormant for a long period of time, then we may be thinking about if that cube has a little bit of potassium added back in. So when we think about self-fed supplements, some considerations to think about is it can be hard to change the amount that's being consumed. So some of the products, the cows just can't consume enough of it to make up for those shortages. That can definitely be a problem if we're dealing with thin animals consuming low quality forages. They're just going to continue to get thinner and thinner because they can't eat enough of that particular supplement option on some of the self-fed supplements. There's less options to choose from. They may require less labor. Some of them it's going to be best to feed year round, just given the low intake and then trying to build a little bit of condition on those cows. So when we get in periods of lower quality forage, we have a little bit of a reserve there. So when we think about tubs, intake's generally pretty low. It's going to be 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds a day. In most situations, majority of tubs out there are going to be molasses based with some non-protein nitrogen. There is a few of them that may be a distiller's base, basically just a giant cube pressed into a block there. When we talk about liquid feeds, we may see where they're designed to be fed in a lick wheel type situation, or and typically those are going to be molasses based, again, molasses and non-protein nitrogen. There is one product out there that's designed to be fed in an open top container, and it's going to be instead of molasses based, distiller soluble based. But again, we're not talking about real big intakes. We're talking about 1 to 3 pounds and moisture content ranging from 30 to 50% on those liquid feeds in most situations. So just to recap, dry matter intakes are generally going to be low. So as a consequence, they're not going to be a great option for thin cattle, or if we're talking about low quality forage. They work better in situations when those cows only need a small bit of supplemental nutrition, and specifically when we're only looking at a small amount of protein. There are some liquid feeds that if you can buy a 48 or 50,000 pound truckload, you may can get a custom formulation where we could get a little bit higher level of intake there. So that is something to be aware of. Some other options when we think about self-fed supplements, here several years ago, there's a company that came on the market where they have feeders that you can set on a timer and they'll put feed out ever so often. So this is an option if you can't be out there and you want to feed some traditional feeds without a limiter in there. Obviously, there's some purchase costs there. And then you do have to be aware about what happens if they stopped working for whatever reason. Bulk feeders, some people like using these. You have to be very, very careful If you get it done wrong, you can have a real wreck. So we're going to need to use a limiter. Never ever use a bulk feeder without a limiter in there when we're talking about the cow herd. Purina and Cargill are the two main companies making limiters. When it comes to limiters, it's critical that you visit with a nutritionist from that company to get it done right. So I'm a ruminant nutritionist, but I don't have access to all the company data. So you really need to talk to the company nutritionist in that situation. Just to kind of give you some examples of what happens if you don't get this done correctly. There was a bull sale several years ago in Texas where they were planning on selling about 600 bulls. They ended up having to cancel the bull sale because they had so many bulls that got subacute acidosis and got foot abscesses and founder from not getting this done correctly. And the majority of those bulls, they had to end up making hamburger out of. That is not an isolated situation by any means. So if you're going to use a limiter, visit with that company nutritionist and make sure you get it done correctly. So kind of some starting points. This is what a lot of people are looking for. So if my hay comes back at this level, or I think my standing forage is similar to this quality, what would I be looking at feeding? So these will be some starting points for you. These TDN values are going to be assuming something from Dairy One or Cumberland Valley. There's a lab here in Texas that has been overestimating TDN about 15 to 20 points. So obviously if you were using that, you would way be misfeeding in those situations. So TDN similar to somebody like Dairy One or Cumberland Valley. If that hay came back at 45% TDN, 5% protein, if I'm talking about a dry cow, just to maintain body condition score, I'm looking at 8 pounds of a high quality 20% cube a day. That would tell us if I did a better job on that forage, I could save quite a bit of money on feed and I'd be much better off in the long run, or buying better quality hay. On a lactating cow, to control weight loss, I'm not going to be able to maintain her, but to control weight loss, 11 pounds of a 20% cube a day. Nobody wants to have to feed that much. So we really got to focus on that forage quality and that hay quality. If we looked at 50% TDN hay, 6.5% crude protein to maintain body conditions for on a dry cow, about 4 pounds of a 20% cube a day. On a lactating cow to control her weight loss, I'm looking at about 6 pounds of a 40% cube per day because I can bump my amount down, but I still need some more protein. So that's why we switched to that 40 in that situation. $55 TDN hay, 9% protein, lactating cow that's in appropriate body condition score. I just need to maintain her. I can get by with just that hay. Don't have to worry about any protein or any supplement. That's definitely going to be my cheapest option there. Lactating cow, control weight loss, about 2 pounds of a 40% cube per head per day. And remember, these are just starting points, so we need to make sure we monitor those cows, and depending on whether we have a mild winter or rough winter, or if we were dealing with standing forage and maybe we underestimated it or overestimated a little bit, we're just going to watch those cows and adjust up or down from those starting points. But those starting points will get us really close. If you're just unsure, just kind of a rough guideline without knowing the situation, 5 pounds of a 20% cube per head per day is kind of what I'd be thinking. But the more information we get, the better job we can do of supplementing those cows. How often do we need to supplement? And this is really important when we're talking about protein supplements. So something like soybean meal, cottonseed meal, 40% cubes, and an all natural 40% cube that doesn't have any additives in there. I can feed that every day, every other day, twice a week, potentially in some situations once a week, and get along really well. So let's just go back to that example of needing to feed 2 pounds per head per day. That's 14 pounds a week. I could do that every day. I could do it 3 times a week, feeding 4.7 pounds per feeding. What I would probably do is twice a week, feeding 7 pounds per feeding. That reduces my labor some, plus I'll get a little more even consumption on average from animal to animal because I'm feeding a little larger amount each feeding there. I'm going to tell you, for me, 14 pounds per feeding is too much. I would want to break that up into feeding more frequently. If I only had to feed 1 pound per day, so that was 7 pounds per week, I would be comfortable with that. That may be a scenario on dry cows and later gestation where you could get by with maybe feeding 7 pounds of a 40% cube per week to those cows, which is just 1 pound per day. If we're dealing with energy supplements or combination energy supplements, it's really best to feed those every day. Feeding at less frequent intervals can lead to some big problems from a rumen health standpoint, from a performance standpoint, and even if we don't have those major problems, we know we're not going to get as much out of that feed. So one study that was published back around 2008, they looked at 3 different supplements, 2 different supplementation levels. And when they looked at feeding 3 times a week versus daily, by feeding the same total amount of feed per week, but feeding it less frequently, they got 10% less performance out of those animals. So 10% less out of that feed. This is another study where they were feeding some heifers here, and they looked at performance as well as rumen pH. And remember when I talked about that subacute acidosis, that's a drop in rumen pH, and we want to try to keep that rumen pH where it's not dropping too much. Is if they looked at feeding, again, the same amount of feed per week, and they compared no feed to feeding that feed every day, every other day, or every third day. And you can see performance here. I put in blue. If they fed every day, those heifers were gaining 1.7 pounds a day. If they went to every other day, 1.65. If they went to every third day, 1.37. So we gave up quite a bit by not feeding that daily. And then you can see rumen pH here. So no supplement daily. We drop it a little bit, but not too much. Every other day, every third day, we're really dropping that pH quite a bit more. And that starts giving us some concern, especially down here for subacute acidosis problems. Pricing supplements just real quickly, and I will tell you later this year, Dr. Smith has a Excel spreadsheet, pretty detailed one, where you can actually look at some pricing. He'll have that up on the beef.tamu.edu website. Well, let's just say we're going to do it by hand, not real hard to do when we're just looking at nutrient costs and not looking at other costs. If we had a 20% cube, that was $10.30 a sack. We have a 38% cube, but it's $13.55 a sack, and we need protein. So I'm not worried about energy, but if I need protein, which one of these is the best buy? So if we go through and do the math, and the way we would do that math is 50-pound sack of feed times 20% protein tells me there's 10 pounds of protein in that feed. That sack cost me $10.30 divided by 10 pounds of protein. Each pound of protein cost me $1.03. In comparison, 38% cubes cost me more per sack, but they're cheaper per unit of protein. Now, if I needed energy, the 20% cubes would be a better buy for energy. You just got to do the math to decide what we need and what's going to be the best buy. Kind of quickly, you could look at this one and just say 20% protein, $10 a sack. Basically, I doubled my protein, but I didn't double the price. So you're going to know automatically that 38% cube is going to be a better buy per unit of protein. And then just to kind of end with some specific drought considerations and realize everything we talked about previously we're going to apply that into the drought situation as well. There's just going to be a few other things we're going to look at. So a big thing from a drought standpoint is if you're short on forage, make sure you think about preserving body condition score on those cows, that forage, so we don't just keep hammering that forage. So you really want to look at using a sacrifice pasture there. So that's where you're going to put them, and you know you're going to hurt long-term forage production there, but at least we haven't damaged those other pastures. And then really think about equity in your operation. So you got to sit down and think about, if I try to hold these cows through a drought, if I'm short on feed and I'm going to have to go buy feed, what does it cost me? And then what's my potential profitability on those cows moving forward? And I'm going to tell you right now, in most situations, it's not going to pay to try to feed those cows if we get into a pretty severe drought situation here. So we're going to want to think about culling some of those animals and reducing the herd size so we have less inputs we're going to have to buy. I won't get into all the culling strategies, but just common sense. Know you want to go in there and cull those older animals, any animals with any temperament problems, udder problems, any other reasons you would typically cull. Those are the ones we want to move sooner. The packer cow market has dropped a little bit, especially this last week, but it's still higher than what it was the same time last year. So just keep that in mind when you're making that decision. Vitamin A is something we do have to pay attention to in a drought because the precursors for vitamin A are found in green growing forages. If you're feeding a good loose mineral with a good level of vitamin A in there, that's not a concern. If you're not, then we do want to look at using a mineral with vitamin A or potentially a vitamin A injection. Mineral is going to be the easiest option. A few years ago, because of a manufacturing issue, we had to go to the injectable, but vitamin A has come back in line on price. We do have to pay attention if we're feeding a lot of grains, whether that's corn or other grain. We may need to add some feed grade limestone back in to balance the calcium phosphorus ratio. And then we got to think about those body condition scores. Remember, we talked about those earlier and how important those are from a reproduction standpoint. And if you don't feed what you need to and let those cows lose too much condition, that just compounds your problem because now you have less cows to feed moving forward. And realize it's a whole lot easier to get body condition score on those cows before calving than after calving. Another specific thing we think about from a drought feeding standpoint is we got to make sure we have enough roughage for those cows to take care of that rumen health. And basically when I say roughage, that's just a collective term we use for hay, forage, other feedstuffs that can cause cattle to chew their cud and help maintain rumen health. So cubes and pellets, with the exception of cottonseed hull pellets, are not going to have meaningful amounts of fiber to actually cause those cattle to chew their cud. So that's why I talked about those forage extender hay stretcher cubes. They weren't a good buy from a feed standpoint. They also don't work well from a roughage standpoint. They just don't have what we need in there to really serve as a roughage source. I'm going to tell you, I may be a little more conservative than some nutritionists, but I don't want to damage that breeding stock moving forward. And I've seen too many cows and replacement heifers that got wrecked because people were being too aggressive. Is I want to keep preferably 10 to 12 pounds of roughage per day in the diet, or if I'm looking at a total mixed feed, roughly 50% of that ration. This is just animals that have been foundered. You can see what happened to the feet there if we have some founder issues. So what we're typically thinking about in a drought situation is we don't have enough hay or we don't have enough standing forage. So we're trying to stretch that forage out. The easiest way to stretch that is to feed that 10 or 12 pounds we talked about and then use a high energy supplement to make up for a lot of the TDN that we're short. Rough guideline whole corn would replace roughly 2¼ pounds of hay that was testing at 50% TDN. if we were looking at a pound of soybean hulls, they would replace about 2 pounds of hay there. If you're definitely wanting some more detail on that, feel free to get in touch with either myself or Dr. Smith. Either one will be glad to help you. I will tell you on our beef.tamu.edu website, if you'll click on publications and then scroll down to the drought management situation, a couple of years ago, I put together some publications for stretching hay supplies for both dry cows and lactating cows. And it'll show you a couple different feeding levels of hay and then some different supplement options, how much you would need to feed in those situations. And then Dr. Smith and I earlier this year put together a paper from a COVID standpoint, but the majority of things apply to adverse weather conditions as well, called Management and Economic Considerations for cow-calf producers during challenging markets or adverse weather conditions. And we'll go into culling in some more detail in that paper. Just a lot of things to get you to think about the thought process moving forward here. It can be found on that same website as well under current news. Scroll down, it's about 3/4 of the way down under that current news section. But this has plenty of detailed examples if you are trying to stretch hay. And with that, I'll be happy to entertain any additional questions that may have come in. Or if you don't have questions now and you do think of something later, get in touch with your county agent. They can get in touch with me, or my email's on the screen there.
All right. Does anybody have a question for Jason? Either put it in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask.
I know I didn't cover everything, so don't hesitate to ask there.
All right. Well, Jason, again, we thank you for your time. And I know there's always a lot of tools to add to our toolbox, and we thank you for that. And main thing, like you say, is getting them through with the right body condition through the winter months. And that's always important. And we thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. That is huge. Thank y'all for having me.
Uh-huh. All right. Next up on our agenda, we have John Nielsen Gammon. He is our Texas State climatologist out of College Station, and he's going to give a little bit of a weather outlook, what we're looking at this winter, and talk a little bit about the El Nino outlook. So if you're there, John, go ahead and come. There he is. Good deal.
Howdy.
Hello, and I see your screen. It looks good.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so normally when I'm talking about the weather and climate outlook, I start with the weather and move on to the climate. I'm going to do it backwards this time around. We're going to start talking about the long-term outlook with respect to climate change, which will sort of help put our short-term situation in context. And main reason for doing that is not to give people scared about climate change or something like that, but enable you to understand what the projections are and what they might mean. Now, particularly for the climate change stuff, this is part of a fairly large consortium that worked on a paper that just came out a few months ago on the difference between what we can say about the climate going forward and what people, farmers, ranchers, water suppliers actually need to know about the climate. And they're not quite the same thing. There's a real lack of detail in the projections or even in the seasonal forecast that make it difficult to actually want to do something different from what you're doing because it's not clear that the outlook's going to be correct. So I want to talk about what some of the previous work has said about the potential for worse droughts in the future in the central and western United States. Then talk about what we found with our paper to drill things down for Texas and talk about some of what's going on with that and the factors that affect it, either making drought more likely or making drought less likely, depending on the factor. So one of the drivers of the climate change is the warming temperatures. Uh, Over on the right, you can see the trend in Texas in every county for the past few decades, and it's getting warmer everywhere in the state at fairly similar rates, about between half a degree and 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. On the left is a comparison of Texas's trends using a 9-year average in maroon, of course, compared to global observations and global climate model forecasts. Climate model forecasts are the smoother ones because it's averaging together several models that don't agree on the timing of El Nino or that sort of thing. You can see the trend is upward in both Texas and the globe by similar amounts. Texas, even averaging over a decade, is a much noisier graph. There's a lot bigger swings that are caused by natural variability rather than climate change. But over the past century, the climate change trend is larger than the decade to decade variations of natural variability. For precipitation, it's a different story on both sides of the plot. So first off, with the annual precipitation on the left, there's a lot of variation. This is precipitation averaged across the entire state of Texas. We still see fairly huge swings by more than a factor of 2, for example, between 2011 and 2015. And there is a little bit of an upward trend here. Actually, there's nothing to sneeze at. The trend is more than 10% over the past century for the eastern half of the state of Texas. And in the Tri-County area, it's close to 15%, which is great as far as plant growth is concerned. But that trend is not robustly predicted to continue. So we don't know if that's going to persist. But in any event, the trend of 10% compared to variations by a factor of 2 means that natural variability is going to be the primary factor affecting rainfall for the foreseeable future. Now, this is a figure from a landmark study that came out about 5 years ago that combined tree ring data, right? If you've got a drought sensitive tree, it's going to grow better when you've had a wet year than a dry year. Turns out it's mainly the soil moisture conditions in mid to late spring that determines how much a tree is going to grow. So we have data from that going back 1,000 years or more, in fact. And then that was compared to climate model simulations of drought severity and the amount of moisture in the top part of the soil. And over most of the past 1,000 years, all we have here is the tree ring data, which shows fluctuations in both the Central Plains and the Southwest. But then the model simulations are tacked onto this, and they project a substantial drying, no matter how you measure it. Now, that's not enough information or evidence to actually say it's definitely going to get drier. What you have to do with this sort of thing is dig into the reasons the model is simulating drier conditions and see whether those reasons make sense and whether we understand why those factors ought to be changing. But at the very least, this was some cause for concern when this came out. And a more recent study looked specifically at the southwestern United States and compared to tree ring data. And the graph on the bottom is a reconstruction of soil moisture. And you see these big fluctuations from wetter than normal conditions to drier than normal. And these actually some persistent periods in green where it was wetter than normal for 2 decades or more, or drier than normal for 2 decades or more. We call these drier periods mega droughts. And over here on the far right, you can see the recent variations, which include 2 very wet periods. And then more recently, the last 2 decades have been way down here on the dry side. So what this paper did was try to figure out why that's happening. So up here on top is, in each of these 3 panels, a graph of the soil moisture conditions averaged over that area with the wet period in the 1920s, wet period in the latter part of the 20th century, and then the dry period recently. And climate models projections basically look like this over here with a drying trend, which certainly doesn't have the natural variability that we observed, but actually has things significantly drier than the normal, which is not too far off from what's actually going on. One thing you can do with a computer model is you can play around with it. So they looked at the effect of changes in rainfall and found models were sort of all over the place with all these thin lines, but the average was fairly flat. The trend was not being produced by model changes in rainfall. So then they looked at combined, well, so then, sorry, here then they looked at the combined effect of temperature and humidity, and that produced the drying, which is similar to the total drying that's simulated by the models. So bottom line here is the drier tendency in the Southwest is due to changes in temperature and humidity rather than changes in precipitation. So the way temperature drives this is it accelerates the evaporation. You get rain, but the soil dries out faster. So on average, you have drier soil conditions. Okay, well, this paper was looking at the Southwest US, and well, part of Texas is in the Southwest US, but you really wouldn't be able to generalize from this paper to what's going on in Texas. The other paper I talked about, well, the Southern Great Plains includes North Texas, but this was the box they used for the Great Plains, and you really wouldn't want to say that what's happening here in Texas is similar to what's happening over the whole plains. So we had the author of this paper to go in and do a Texas specific analysis, breaking things down into West Texas and East Texas. And the area we care about is East Texas, so I'll focus on those results. East Texas on the bottom. What you're seeing here is the reconstructed late spring drought based on the tree rings in East Texas for the past 1,000 years. And the red are the mega drought periods, including the 12th and 13th centuries. The most recent one was in the 15th century. There have been droughts since then, like the 1860s and the 1950s show up, but they didn't last long enough to make it into this mega drought category. And most recently, the latter part of the 20th century was wet for us, just like it was wet for the southwestern United States. Okay, compare that to model simulations, and much like the Great Plains and Southwest US, the models show a drying, but let me just tell you, the green line is the topsoil moisture, the top foot or so, and that only dries a relatively small amount compared to the deep soil moisture. Here's another way of looking at it. The bars over here show the range of the middle 50% of models. So a quarter of the models are actually predicting an increase in topsoil moisture in Texas. Of course, another quarter of the models are predicting a substantial decrease. And for deep soil moisture, they really have a wide range of opinions. So it seems likely that the soil will dry out to some extent based on these model simulations, but it's certainly not a guarantee. We could get lucky and actually end up with wetter conditions going forward, but the money would be on drier conditions because of the higher temperatures. We're talking about a gradual change here over the next 90 to 100 years. And I'll also mention this is sort of the worst case scenario in terms of the climate model scenarios. This assumes that carbon dioxide emissions are about as high as they could possibly be. So even if the average model is perfectly correct, it's probably overestimating what will actually happen because actual climate change probably won't be nearly that drastic. So the trend is in the wrong direction, but the magnitude of that trend might not be too much of a problem. So why do the models give so many different answers, and why is it hard to say specifically what's going to happen to drought? Well, it's a combination of factors. Obviously, if you have a decrease in rainfall, things will be drier. The change in temperature is going to lead to drier conditions because temperatures are going up. If you have more extreme rainfall, you'll have some wet months that are wetter than they used to be, and have some dry months that are drier than they used to be. And that would tend to produce drier soil conditions overall, because more of the rain will be falling on saturated ground and will run off, or more of the rain will be intense and will run off. So the increase in extremes that we expect would be have a drying trend, but that's already in the models also. Changes in the timing of rainfall might be a problem. In fact, the models are pretty consistent in saying that if we get less rain, it'll probably be in summertime that we get less rain, which of course, summertime is when conditions tend to be driest. So that's a problem. And changes in biomass. If we get, well, carbon dioxide, one effect of that is to encourage plant growth, because plants use carbon dioxide to make their growth materials. So on the short term, if we get more plant growth, that provides for more opportunities to draw water from the soil. So that could cause drying. What would cause a decrease of drought would cause wetting. Well, if rainfall continues to increase, that would sure do it. Carbon dioxide makes plants more water efficient, which would help keep moisture in the soil. And over the long term, as the ecosystem adjusts to the different conditions, it'll probably be more efficiently using water, and that could lead to reduced drought conditions. On an individual storm scale, changes in soil moisture and rainfall extremes can have complicated but generally fairly small effects on overall soil moisture from year to year. So bottom line here, drought is a complicated thing. The biggest effects are probably rainfall, average rainfall, but we don't know whether that's going to change much. Temperature we do know about, and changes in the way carbon dioxide affects plants is something we know about fairly well. So making a projection about drought involves teasing out all of those different effects. But the bottom line for folks on the ground, for ranchers, is how important is all of that compared to, say, natural variability, which is responsible for rainfall changing by a factor of 2 or more from year to year. And the answer is, on the short term, probably not very important compared to natural variability, except that with the higher temperatures, things will tend to dry out faster. So our droughts become hotter, but with the increased carbon dioxide, plants are a bit more efficient at using water. So that helps a bit to compensate for temperatures. Okay, so let's turn to what's actually going on right now, or at least over the past, since the beginning of the year, in the Tri-County area and surrounding stations. And it's a basically a tale of 2 periods. The first half of the year was decently wet. Rainfall averaged across the region about 15 to 20 inches, which is a little bit more than normal. But since late June, or even practically since the beginning of June, it has been fairly dry, except for one burst of rainfall activity in early September. So that is most of the spread in total accumulated rainfall by the present time is due to the variation of the impact of that early September rainfall. So let's take a look at how this affects conditions in different locations. So percent of normal precipitation so far for the whole year is mostly above normal. If it's below normal, it's below normal in just a few places, except for Lampasas County, which is doing a bit worse. But the problem again is the timing of that rainfall. Heck, over the last 2 months, it's been fairly wet. The many places have gotten 6 to 8 inches more than they normally would over the past 60 days. But it was really all at once during the early part of that 60-day period. So it was good at helping to provide water to stock tanks. It wasn't all that good for providing water to the soil. And then since then, it's been quite dry. The past 30 days, most of the area hasn't even seen a single raindrop, and the wettest places are still less than 50% of normal for the past 30 days. And that's not just in the Tri-County area. That's for most of the state of Texas. In fact, most of the southwestern United States has just been bone dry, um, which of course means don't look to Oklahoma and Kansas for supplemental hay. It's mainly going to be places farther east, such as Louisiana, which has gotten more water than it knows what to do with the succession of hurricanes, which from the right side allows for plenty of warm season grass growth, and also the cold season grasses are well established there, um, whereas they're certainly having a hard time in most of the state of Texas. Okay, well, the short-term forecast, mostly dry for the next several days at least. We've got a couple cold fronts on the horizon. First off, pretty sure thing, we're going to cold front Friday morning, probably a fairly weak cold front. Um, it's a bit too far out to be confident about it, but right now it looks like we might get a pretty strong cold front Sunday evening. And the cold front right now is expected to stall across southern Texas, and we might get some decent cold rains after that. This map here is showing the model simulated rainfall through the end of the month, and there's a decent chance of getting an inch of rain, which of course wouldn't be anywhere near normal for the month, but would be helpful. Like I said, this is quite a ways out. Probably not until Thursday would I want to be confident in the strength of the cold front and whether it's likely to bring rainfall. One problem with strong cold fronts this time of year, of course, is they kick things into dormancy, um, which limits forage growth on the one hand, but on the other hand, also increases the risk of um, wildfire. And the weather pattern that's most conducive to high fire risk is plenty of rain, followed by no rain, followed by curing of the fine fuels. And we've had plenty of rain first part of the year, followed by no rain, and now um, with the drying and the threat of a hard freeze with this cold front, we could have curing of fine fuels. Of course, if it's not this cold front on Sunday evening, there'll be one eventually that's going to come along and allow for grasses to dry out and make the fire risk high. So be conscious of that, both in terms of avoiding anything that could start a fire under high wind conditions, or just plain the threat of fire when you do have high winds. Looking forward a bit farther, we turn to El Nino and La Nina. Things going on in the tropical Pacific are the primary way we're able to look at tendencies of precipitation, especially in the wintertime. November through March, November through May is the time range in which La Nina and El Nino have a big effect. And El Nino is the one where you've got warmer than normal temperatures in the tropical Pacific. La Nina is the one where it's drier than normal. What we're seeing right now is, La Nina is the one where it's cooler than normal in the tropical Pacific. It means drier than normal conditions for Texas. So here's the difference of temperatures in the Pacific compared to normal. Got South America here, got Australia over here, and the La Nina region is running cooler than normal by about 1 degree Celsius. You can see this cold tongue of water along the equator. That's the sign of La Nina. And if we look at how temperatures in the tropical Pacific have changed over the past year, they went from a marginal El Nino, warmer than normal, to most recently, over the past couple of months, La Nina conditions. And if that lasts for another 2 or 3 months, it'll be an official La Nina event. So unfortunately, that means drier than normal conditions are expected for Texas over the winter time. And how confident are we that La Nina is going to persist? Well, we're pretty confident. This is a slice looking down under the ocean. So the ocean surface is the top of this graph, and we're looking at the tropical Pacific from Australia to South America. And the warm colors are warm water. The cool colors are cool water. And the cool water is being brought way up to the surface by upwelling conditions along the equator. So there's an awful lot of cold water that's coming to the surface, and that's going to cause La Nina to persist for several months. So because of that, the forecasts are for drier than normal conditions being likely. So we'll start with the November forecast for the month. Over on the left, warmer than normal temperatures are expected. Over on the right, below normal precipitation is expected. Now, the way to read these things, well, you can go by the colors. It tells you whether it's going to be expected to be warmer and drier or cooler and wetter. If you care about the actual numbers, let's look at this 50 line. That says there's a 50% chance that temperatures are going to be significantly above normal. And this 50 says there's a 50% chance rainfall will be significantly below normal. So the converse of that, there's a 50% chance rainfall will be close to normal, or maybe even above normal. But if your dividing line is right on normal, this is saying basically two-thirds to three-quarters chance of below normal rainfall conditions next month. And again, likely above normal temperatures go along with that. You'll see the same thing going forward through the winter and spring, which is about how long La Nina is supposed to last. Below normal expected November through January. Below normal expected, not quite as certain, February through April. Once you go farther out than that, this EC means equal chances, or the way I think of it, extremely clueless. Might be wet, might be dry, might be near normal. No way to tell. And mainly, there's no way to tell because on the one hand, La Nina is projected to end by then, so we don't know what the tropical Pacific will be doing at that point. And number two, the tropical Pacific doesn't have much effect on our rainfall in the summertime anyway, so there's really no good basis for projecting rainfall next summer. Temperature is pretty easy. Remember that temperatures are going up by more than half a degree every decade. So temperatures, if you didn't even know anything about El Nino or La Nina, you'd say, well, chances are it'll be wetter than normal. I'm sorry, warmer than normal. And indeed, that's the forecast. Warmer than normal across Texas. It's especially warmer than normal in the southern United States in these forecasts because of La Nina. La Nina makes the southern U.S. warmer than it normally would be anyway. Plus, climate change is making things warmer than they would be anyway everywhere. La Nina is strong enough to cancel out climate change in the northern United States and Canada. And by the way, that means that even though the average conditions will tend to be warm, we have that cold air that'll be sitting up there along the Canadian border. And occasionally we're going to get a cold front come through, like the one that might happen on Sunday evening, which will bring seriously cold temperatures temporarily before things warm up again. So bottom line for what we're looking at going forward, probably drier conditions in general because temperatures are going up. And that also makes drought more severe now because temperatures have already gone up by 1 or 2 degrees compared to what they were on average over the 20th century. On the short term, this particular winter looks dry because of natural variability, La Nina, and the lack of rain. The warmer temperatures will contribute to evaporation, so they certainly won't help with the drought conditions. But at least it'll be wintertime when evaporation isn't really all that strong. So the main driver for the drought we're looking at right now is rainfall. And unfortunately, it does look like drought because we've been running below normal for the past several months. October has been ridiculously dry, and the odds of recovering this winter are very small because of La Nina. So unfortunately, bad news all around with that, but that's the way the forecast seems to be shaking out at this time. So I can take questions now. Also, if you need to contact me later or want to follow up, you've got my email address there, and also our website, climatetexas.taamu.edu. So thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have a quick question for John? Again, go ahead and unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything, but again, John, we thank you for your time. I mean, I know good news, bad news, drier or colder. We all need to be thinking about it as we go through these winter months. And so we thank you for your time. And I know you were busy today, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon.
Yeah, sure thing.
Uh-huh. All right, that is all we have for you today. I hope you did get something out of today that you can add to your toolbox. And again, if you want a copy of these presentations, just get with your agent and we'll be glad to email it to you. It's all been recorded, so we'll catch up with you later.